I currently work for County Executive Ike Leggett in the Office of the County Executive, and I have been living in Montgomery County for almost 20 years and working in Montgomery County government for almost 10 years, actually, not 8, almost 10 now. So I think I know a thing or two about my community and my government, and I have witnessed the dramatic, I need to be louder, dramatic transformation of our million-plus people community, even from 10 or 20 years ago. And I'm very happy to share with you my perspectives, observations from working and living and being involved in the community, and my personal life experience and some of my observations of our community. So I'm going to start by giving you a quick intro of myself, why I'm standing in front of you. It's not really necessarily having much to do with my day job, which is mostly economic and workforce development. That's why I work closely with Montgomery College and other academic institutions, and many businesses and community organizations. But it's mostly because of who I am. I am an immigrant. I came to this country from Shanghai, China. I grew up in China during the probably most tumultuous years of its modern history, during the Cultural Revolution. How many of you have heard of that? The Cultural Revolution was a very traumatic experience for many individuals and a family. And my extended family got persecuted, had a very difficult time. So when I got an opportunity to study in this country, that was the late 80s, I jumped on that. When the country opened itself to the rest of the world, we were allowed to go out and see the rest of the world and to study and to better ourselves. So I jumped on that, and my parents used their whole year's savings and bought me a one-way ticket to study in the United States. And I landed in a small town in the middle of nowhere, cornfields in Indiana, which was a little change from Shanghai, I would say, right? But when I left, it was like only 13 million people. Now it's like 25 million people. It practically doubled itself, So there were a lot of cultural adjustments, linguistic struggles. I quickly realized that one was how friendly everybody was. And I remember the first letter I wrote home, I said to my parents, it's very, very cold. But people are very warm. Strangers will smile at you for no reason and say hi to you. That was unheard of, or unseen, when I grew up in the metropolitan large city. And so my cultural and language learning started there for the past 28 years of living and working in this country. And I also realized that my English was just so inadequate. Whatever I had learned in China was so inadequate. Because before I came here, I was able to recite speeches by the famous Americans, as one way of learning English, because you learn grammar, textbook stuff, and then you recite a lot of things in order to memorize, right? That's how adults learn another language, not by imitating our parents or friends. So I could recite Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream, and I was very proud that I could do that. But, of course, that wasn't enough to carry me. I couldn't understand jokes. I couldn't understand a lot of simple stuff, let alone lectures by professors. So I actually used a Walkman to record a lot of lectures so I could go back to my room and listen and keep up with the coursework. So fast forward, today I am a community leader. I am very active in the Asian American community and just in the community in general. I serve on many different boards. I'm on the board of Suburban Hospital. I just finished serving on several other boards, including Leadership Montgomery and all that. This is a wonderful community where anyone can find a very rich, rewarding life, no matter what else you do, So today, I try to tie all of these things together to share with you what it means to be an Asian American in the National Capital Region. But no matter what you learn about what other communities are, it's always coming back to reflection about ourselves, about you as an individual, about us together as a community, right? Every time I learn about another community, I always know more about myself. So that's the beauty of human connection. So why are we talking about Asian Americans? We're talking about Asian Americans in the National Capital Region, which is very different from Asian Americans in other parts of the country. As you know, there are several areas or regions in the United States where Asian Americans have a very strong presence and a much longer history, right? Can you name some of them? Yes, San Francisco. Did you know that San Francisco in Chinese means the old gold mountain? It literally still, when the Chinese people translate, even to this day, when they call the city of San Francisco, they call it Old Gold Mountain. That's the literal translation of that name, because that was where the Chinese, that's the place where previous waves, the earliest waves of the Chinese migrants came in order to dig for the gold, as did many other people. And another?
New York.
Yes, right. So the coastal areas, the Ellis Island and Angel Island, have been receiving a lot of immigrants over the years, including Asian immigrants from many different countries, right? So the greater Washington, D.C. region is relatively new to immigration period, not just to Asian immigrants, but to immigration period. Why do you think this region experienced that much growth of immigration?
I would say maybe economic stability, the federal government, employment.
Yes, absolutely. A strong economy is the best magnet for attracting people, talented people or people who just want to seek better opportunities. The reason I came to this country was because I wanted to seek better economic and educational opportunity. And this region attracted so many people from around the world. And because we don't border any country, our immigrant population is very diverse. Many of them actually did not come directly to this region. They came to this country, just like me, and then they gradually found their way to this region. And so today's Montgomery County is made of 3/4 migrants or transplants. 3/4 of Montgomery County's 1.1 million population came from elsewhere. They were not born in state. That is a very startling number. We are probably number 1 or 2 in the country in terms of the highest percentage of people who were not born in state. We are a community of newcomers. It's a new community. We just doubled our population since the 70s. So we're still shaping a sense of place, a sense of identity, and a sense of community. Do you agree? We're still getting to know each other. So this is a great subject to talk about. Tomorrow somebody could be talking about the Latino community, which will be another fabulously fascinating subject. So I'm really honored and privileged that you are interested in learning about the Asian American community. We are, in Montgomery County, about 15% of the population. I think the Latino community is about 18%, and the Black community is about, and that's between the native-born and also African immigrant communities, probably about 17% now. Is also very strong. So it's almost like a half of the Montgomery County population is white, the other half is minority. And among the minority community, what's remarkable is it's almost 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 between the Latinos and Asians and Blacks, almost, which is remarkable. You probably would never have that kind of breakdown ever, right? So we're living in a really, really interesting time in history. Right when our population became majority minority, Washington, D.C., which is our next door neighbor, I these days call Washington, D.C. our bedroom, you know, because so many people want to live there, but they actually work here, right? They flipped the other way. It used to be what they called a chocolate city, majority Black, and now it became, the Black population actually became minority population in Washington, D.C. It went the other way. And so that kind of remarkable transformation also just took place in our lifetime, in the past 20 years or so. I'm sort of like a witnessing and studying history and diversity and demography, and I find everything to be very fascinating. So why are we talking about Asian Americans in the National Capital Region? For several reasons. One, it is the fastest growing community, faster than even the Latino community, okay? And two, it is probably the least understood minority or immigrant racial group. And the reason I say that is because we hear a lot of advocacy groups speaking out on issues from the Latino community, and African Americans in general have had a longer history in this country. And so there have been some more established organizations and cultural fabrics and churches and community organizations. The Asian American community, because of the super diversity of the many different languages and many different ethnicities and nations and how new they are, there's not a cohesiveness and identity yet. And so it's very hard to reach them or understand them. Okay, and so that is creating all kinds of challenges for policymakers, all kinds of challenges for people who want to reach that market, who just want to connect with that community. And also, it is what I call an awkward minority, and I will explain more about that. It is a minority that is very inconvenient in our way of thinking about what a minority should be or it is. Because in this country, being a minority has certain connotations. Certain connotations meaning you probably have less opportunities, or you need help with certain things, that you need to strive to be of certain things. And so when Asian Americans come along, they have higher test scores in some cases. They speak out on issues that make them look like they are pitting against the other minority groups. It became a very uncomfortable phenomenon for a lot of local leaders. It became a very uncomfortable dialogue that no one really wants to have, okay? And it created some tension as well. And so part of it is because we understand so little about that community. Part of it is we expect immigrants to be minorities with accent. We think they are just minorities, when in fact immigration itself is such a new phenomenon for our community that we just have not taken the time to really understand what it means to have such diversity without enough deep integration. So this class is as much about diversity as about community integration and some of the difficult topics we need to talk about, okay? So what is Asian American? What is in the name? People sometimes call us Asians, sometimes call us Asian Americans, sometimes call us AAPI. Have you heard of that term? Okay, so in this region, this is not a very commonly used term, except for people who work for probably federal government, because all their programs say AAPI, this and that. It stands for Asian American and Pacific Islanders. Okay, in this region, again, because our history of having a lot of immigration or immigrants is relatively short, we don't have that unified identity called the AAPI. But in some other areas where there's stronger Pacific Islander presence, that is an established term, Asian American and Pacific Islanders. So in census and many other ways of tracking data, they oftentimes lump us together as the AAPI. In this region, because so many people just came, their identity is ethnic rather than racial, right? Because overall in America, we put people in racial categories, which is Black, Latino, Asian. But many people I know would say, I don't know what it means to be Asian. You know, it was actually kind of funny because I was at a community event at a governor's house years ago when I was serving on governor's commission. And the photographer came, said, okay, everybody take a picture with the governor and all that. So we all lined up. The photographer joyfully said, how do you say cheese in Asian? I was like, a lot of us actually don't eat cheese, first of all. But that's to the point, which is there is no such thing as an Asian language. There's no unified identity, right? And that is oftentimes lost. So what's in the name is also related to what we identify with, okay, or don't. So you will hear people mention those terms. Here, because of the nature of our population, we just call ourselves Asian Americans for convenience sake. That that includes several major categories: the East Asians, the South Asians, and the Southeast Asians. Okay, so the East Asia communities would be people from originally, and they could be born here, okay? So when I say the Asian American community, which is 15%, I'm also talking about people like my son, who was born and raised here in this country, okay? Not necessarily all of them are immigrants, right? So the Asian American community is made of East Asian community, South Asian community, and the Southeast Asian community. The East Asian ones would be Chinese and Korean and Japanese. We have very, very few Japanese in this area. They stopped migrating to the United States a long time ago, basically. But we do have strong presence of Chinese, Korean, and Indian communities. These are the top 3 in Montgomery County and in the region as well as Filipinos and the Vietnamese, okay, top 5. And the East Asian and Southeast Asians, of course, are Vietnamese, Laosians, Cambodians, and Thai, and people from Myanmar, Burmese. And of course, the South Asians. The largest South Asian communities are the Indians and the Pakistanis. We have very strong, vibrant communities, community organizations in both of these communities. Let's see, I talked about that. So what are some of the key characteristics of the Asian Americans in the National Capital Region? I just mentioned one of which was we're very new and we have distinct languages and cultures. We're also very diverse in our religion because we worship different gods, right? So I don't know if you have heard of this term, which is highway to heaven. Have you heard of that? Okay. Where's that? New Hampshire Avenue, exactly. New Hampshire Avenue, why is it called a highway to heaven?
All the different churches, temples, and all that.
That's right. All the different temples, the churches, the synagogues, and Orthodox, whatever. It's all lined up. It's beautiful. The structures are all gorgeous. And you should really drive down there and check them out. And the festivals just look like a whole city descend on them, year round. I have been to heaven many times, by the way, and back. It was great. So some of the key characteristics are that we are new. Mostly 3/4 of Asian Americans in the National Capital Region are immigrants compared to New York or California. Okay. And the other one is, of course, we're diverse, multilingual, multinational, and multi-religious. And also we compare to previous waves of Asian immigrants, compared to some other communities, and compared to population in this region in general, the Asian immigrants tend to be well educated. And I'm not saying there's no economic and social disparity. There is, there always will be. But by and large, the Asian Americans in the National Capital Region are well educated, and many of them have quickly found their success. And a part of the reason is because many of them came because of the educational opportunities. They go to Johns Hopkins University, University of Maryland, they are scholars, they get top scholarships. And part of the reason is also because many of them, because of their STEM degrees, can quickly find the jobs in our many dozens of federal institutions that need the PhDs. I often jokingly say Montgomery County is one of those places in the world where even PhDs can find good jobs. You know what I mean? Okay. People don't go into a PhD degree to make money usually, right? They go there because they love what they do. They're passionate about science and technology and other things that they study. But we are one of those rare communities where there are a lot of PhDs who are making very decent livings. Yes, so we are very well-educated community. In fact, the Indian American community here, which is largely immigrants, 3/4 of Indians in Montgomery County have at least a bachelor's degree, and many more have advanced degrees, way higher than the general population. And we should all be very proud of that. And also because of the nature of the population, another characteristic is they are very mobile. They tend to move around unless they find a place that they are comfortable with, but they are overall quite mobile. They will chase the next opportunity. This region has attracted so many from even other states because of this region's economic opportunity. But if you think back of the time when it happened, when this region all of a sudden have seen this huge influx of people from Asian countries, or other regions. Do you remember when that happened?
After the Vietnam War, there was a big.
It's actually more recent than that, just recently, in recent years, in Montgomery County and the region. Montgomery County is simply one of the largest economic jurisdictions in the region. 90s, yes. So why? What happened here? Thank you. It's the dot-com boom that transformed the way federal government does business, in how they archive documents, how they process information, how they contract, and how they do a lot of things, right? And also, many private industries also have to transform themselves. And that really was a major impetus and driver of all of the talented people who came here. Many of them came here without much IT knowledge, but because the industry kept hiring and hiring, many of the people I know, even those with PhDs, switched. Like somebody would have a PhD in some difficult degrees that nobody can pronounce, and they would get a certificate after a few months of training, let's say in Montgomery College or somewhere, and they could get a job that pays very well in IT companies, right? And that happens quite often. As immigrants, you don't get very picky about what jobs you can get. You just have to make a living. I worked in dish rooms and bathrooms and whatever, making, very minimum wage from $3.80 to $4.25 while I was trying to finish my degrees. And that's the immigrant story. We all have lived that, right? Okay. So some of the settlement patterns of the Asian Americans in the National Capital Region, the majority of the Asian American population nationwide live mostly along the coastal areas. There's not much in between, okay, because of the economic opportunities. And in the National Capital Region, it is pretty much the same, which is wherever there's more density, there's more transit, there's more job opportunities, you will see more immigrant population in general, and especially the Asian American population. So in this area, Fairfax County tops, it's the #1 stronghold of Asian population. Almost 1 in 5 of their residents is of Asian descent. Loudoun County, which is now nationally ranked #1 in their wealth, measured by household income, I think, Loudoun County. And so Maryland side, it's Montgomery County, Howard County. The largest minority group in Howard County is Asian Americans. Koreans especially, Koreans, Chinese. And of course, Prince George's County has a very strong presence of Asian Americans, but not nearly as much as Montgomery County. Montgomery County's largest is Chinese and Indian. Almost 2 out of 3 Asian Americans in Montgomery County are either Chinese or Indian. So these are 2 very large communities. And they're mostly along the 270 corridors as well, and some along 495 Beltway area, but mostly not inner Beltway, outer Beltway. Even places like Clarksburg has attracted a lot of Asians because, one, it's relatively more affordable compared to the rest of the county, and also it has good school districts. So usually when people try to figure out where to live and settle down their communities, they have to look at where the jobs are, so it's relatively reasonable commute, and good school districts, right? School districts usually is #1 reason. And that was the reason I came to Montgomery County, because at first when we moved to this region, I was working at American University and living nearby in the tiny 1-bedroom apartment. And when it was time to buy a home and settle down, we couldn't afford anything in DC, so we looked further and further and further away until our realtor found one house that was right across from a horse farm. And I thought, oh my God, this is so rural, so far from everything. How are we gonna do that? But now I look back, I was like, that's nothing, Prices has gone double and tripled in that neighborhood. And that place is now considered quite unaffordable for a lot of young families. And that really speaks to the dramatic growth of this region. Have you heard that Rockville is now the real Chinatown? You got to read the Washingtonian magazine. You got to read the Bethesda magazine. Both of them have articles that say Rockville is the new Chinatown, because DC's Chinatown, which has an arch, right? But if you look at all these stores, they're just American stores translated into Chinese words, you know. They are very mainstream. There's not much of a Chinese cultural flavor. The real Chinatown, the best restaurants, the best of whatever, is really in Rockville. Okay. And have you heard of the W high school clusters? Yes, exactly. The reason I bought a house in North Potomac was because of the Wooden cluster. I still live in a Wooden cluster. So the Wooden cluster, which is Thomas Wooden High School cluster, Walt Whitman, Walter Johnson, Winston Churchill, these are the 5 W schools that a lot of Asian families are gravitated to. And the real estate agents these days are so savvy, whether they are Asians or not. Whenever they see Asian parents walking in, they'll say, oh, this is in that cluster, right? It's an important selling point for them. And of course, BCC, the Bethesda Chevy Chase cluster, is also very competitive. These are not the only good schools. I'm just giving you example and what people have been circulating around. You know, say, oh yeah, that's one of the W schools and all that. And of course, where I live, North Potomac, which is literally between Rockville and Gaithersburg, is now a burgeoning community of itself. It's unincorporated, just like Germantown, but it has the highest concentration of Asian population in Montgomery County. It's almost like 1 in 3 is Asian, you know, in our community. So the National Capital Region is called by the Brookings Institution scholars in their book as the Edge Gateway, meaning we are new to immigration, and we have just spent some time talking about that. What that also means is in 21st century, when immigrants come to this country, they tend to settle directly in the suburbs rather than urban cores, as in the past 2 centuries, right? So when you think of Ellis Island, the Angel Island, and all that, those were urban areas where the Italians and the East Europeans and other migrants tend to settle. Nowadays, people tend to go directly to the suburbs. That is the 21st century phenomenon. So suburbs have essentially become the battleground on a lot of the ugly immigration issues that have been unfolding in front of our eyes, both at the national level and the local level. You just need to ask our police chief and ask our county executive some of the debates that we have heard, right? They all came from suburban communities. Suburbs have really been defining the debates about immigration in many ways. So generally speaking, the Asian Americans in the 21st century have really been redefining themselves in terms of their overall image and in terms of their overall standing as Americans and as new Americans in many ways. It does not mean that we don't have struggles, but by and large, in 21st century, Asian Americans have found many opportunities that previous generations would never dream of. In fact, they are not only leaders of many different industries, they are also finding their voices politically. There are more and more elected officials at all levels, and politics, which used to be called the last frontier for Asian Americans, is now fair game to a lot of people because they are so well educated. They don't want to wait a generation to speak out. They don't want to delegate that American dream to their children. They are capable, more than capable, to speak out on their own, to advocate, and to participate in the democratic process. So you will see more and more Asian Americans participating in local affairs, in serving on the boards, in becoming their own voices, which is all to be celebrated. But there are divisions, not only across different ethnicities within the Asian community or family, because we have so many different ethnicities and they speak different languages, they don't interact with each other by and large, but also between the Asian American community and the larger community, there are still divisions. And there's division between the Asian Americans, immigrants, and their children's generation, ideologically as well as in many other ways. Okay. Any questions so far?
I just have a question.
Yeah.
As far as you're talking about division, I'm just curious, and maybe you'll address it later, is why it seems to me in the community I live in the Wooden cluster, that that there's a very strong divide between the Asian community and we'll call it the American community, for lack of a better word. And like using Wooten as an example, they had their own PTA versus trying to integrate together. And it intrigues me why that community doesn't want to assimilate the way other immigrants did, like back in the 20s and 30s. And they still had high values for education and other things too, but it just seems like they want to remain separated. And I'm just curious what your thoughts on that are.
So what do you mean they have their own PTA? Because I served in the Wharton PTA myself when my kid was in high school. There
was a separate Asian PTA, and they would speak whatever languages, and so they had two separate PTAs at the Wharton High School.
I think it was the Chinese one, and I think I know the person who heads that PTA. I think it's less of an issue of them not wanting to be integrated. It's more an issue of them believing the larger PTA organization is not speaking for them and their particular interests. I'm happy to talk more about that if we have time or privately with you, but this is a new phenomenon. Yes.
But I'm just saying, just overall, like
right.
even in the community I live in, I find that there's not an assimilation. People don't want to get together. There's no sense of, hi, how are you? You know, tell me a little bit about yours. You. Like it's not like that, and I don't know why there's a divide. I'm curious about that.
I think the cultural and linguistic barriers are difficult to overcome. You have seen even people who have mastered the English language professionally may find it awkward to connect with their American colleagues and neighbors socially. It is just difficult when you don't laugh at the same jokes, don't watch the same sports, when you don't gravitate toward the same things. And it's just a totally different lifestyle, and that makes it difficult to build cohesion and trust, okay? A lot of times, very competent Asian Americans cannot be elevated to leadership positions, not because they don't work hard, not because they don't know the subject code, not because they don't have the ambition, but because people don't perceive them as leader-like materials. And a lot of those criteria are very subjective. Asians tend to thrive when the criteria are transparent and fair to everybody, like tests. They tend to fail when the criteria keep shifting or not transparent. Like it depends on who you play golf with. They almost always lose, just like a woman. And it's not limited to Asians. You know what I'm talking about, okay? All right. So who controls power usually decides who else gets to play, right? This is the social structure we're talking about. And it's not limited to professional realm. PTAs are social structure. If the leaders of PTAs don't have the cultural awareness to intentionally bring people along, you may inadvertently make people feel unwelcomed. And a lot of that is unintentional, you know. And I think there are a lot of well-meaning people in our community who really want to reach out. They even reach out to people like me who are perceived as cultural liaisons. And I'm more than happy to recommend people for awards, to promote what you do to the new communities. But let me give you one example. I have been asked by so many nonprofit organization leaders and say, we need more board members. The Asian community has wealth. They now have time. The kids are grown. Why can't they serve on our boards? I said, okay, let's break it down to what that means. One, you're looking for people who can speak the kind of English enough to understand what you're talking about, right? And to contribute at board meetings, okay? Two, you want people who have some wealth to write checks. Some of them are pretty big checks, like $1,000 to serve on your board, right? And three, you want people who are interested in what you do, okay? And also just that kind of overall civic mindset. A lot of people didn't grow up in that kind of cultural environment. Government either controls everything or let it fall. You don't have a third sector. We have private sector, public sector, and nonprofit sector in this country. And civic sector is very, very important in holding the community together, in self-empowering. But that's a new concept to a lot of people. So it's hard when you have to explain all of these things. There's no cultivation of pipeline. last minute outreach doesn't work. I tried for over 10 years. It doesn't work. So I ended up serving on all these boards. It gets very expensive, I tell you. But what I'm trying to say is there's no easy answer to integration. Diversity happens. Integration takes very hard work. It takes very intentional hard work. And if we are afraid of talking about race relations in 21st century, then we would just avoid interacting because that's the safest way, right? So let me just, but thank you for the great question. I can go on forever, as you can, because I'm passionate. I live this stuff. I don't want to be the interpreter for people on both sides to say, why can't we do better, right? And it's very hard. So let me, for the next part, I want to talk a little bit about history of Asians in America in general, and then that will provide some bigger perspectives, okay? So the early Asian settlers in America happened way back before even the founding of this country. The earliest Asian settlements can be traced to the mid-1700s when sailors from the Philippines and China arrived on Spanish ships as part of the trade missions. And then some of them later on settled to some places like a Louisiana area. And then by 1870s, nearly 9% of the California population actually was of Chinese origin descent. So over the years, over the centuries, there have been commerce going on, there have been trade, and there have been scholars coming, there have been activities. There's actually a fascinating book written by a Caucasian American who's married to a Chinese native called The Beautiful Country in the Middle Kingdom, about the relationship over a couple of centuries between China and the United States. That's really fascinating because the word China in Chinese means the Middle Kingdom, the center of the universe. You know, the Chinese like to think we are the center of the universe, and the Americans like to think we are the universe, right? Yeah. What else is out there, you know? And then America, literally in Chinese, means the beautiful country. Okay, so that's why the book is called The Middle Kingdom and the Beautiful Country. Okay, we ought to be able to laugh at ourselves in order to learn, right? Have perspectives, you know. And then the Japanese also had a significant presence in the United States by the late 1800s. So even though this region has just seen a large influx of Asian immigration in the past 20 years, the country has seen Asian migration over the past couple hundred years. An early era of Chinese migration in the mid-1800s were mostly Chinese laborers. That's why San Francisco is called the Old Gold Mountain. And I want to talk a little bit about that chapter, which is a fairly unfortunate chapter of our history in terms of human rights and integration and all that. And hopefully we can learn the lesson, because there are some parallels to be drawn between what happened then and what we are seeing now, you know, which is the yellow peril and the model minority kind of thing. Back in the 1800s, because of the need for laborers to dig gold, there was actually recruitment of Chinese laborers from China by people here to make them, you know, affordable laborers to mine the gold, because they're hardworking, they don't bargain, they're willing to do whatever it takes to build that local economy. But then as the numbers grew, they became a threat. They became a threat to a lot of the white laborers who also wanted the same access to gold. So there was massive concern on two levels. One was concern about the economic competition, because these people were willing to work for nothing, essentially, you know. So wage compression and competition. And another level of concern was the cultural erosion, which I hope also resonates with you, because sometimes we also hear people these days talking about how certain immigrants are bringing down our cultural standards and values, as if we are perfect now. The way it is just perfect, right? don't touch our culture because any newcomers coming in just could only make it worse, that kind of fear. So the fear of cultural erosion, calling them a lower culture, inferior, the lowest, the most vile and degraded of our race, and all those kind of words were used to describe the Chinese laborers. So as a result, I don't know how many of you have heard of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, right? Many of you have. This was legally sanctioned action. It was a law enacted by the Congress, signed into law by President Chester A. Arthur in 1882 on May 6. The purpose of that law was to exclude the Chinese from coming to the United States. So it was legal exclusion against the one single ethnicity by the United States government. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 lasted for decades. And of course, it not only excluded the Chinese, it also excluded many other Asians from entering this country. At first, they started with the Chinese laborers, and then it expanded, actually, to exclude more people from Asian countries. And that, unfortunately, became the law of the land until after the World War II, essentially, And because of the anti-Asian sentiment, that made the violence against the Asians more acceptable. And under the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, for decades, there have been reports of people being lynched, being killed for no reasons. There were violence inflicted upon villages of laborers because they wanted to drive them out. There's actually a Montgomery County resident who is a scholar teaching at University of Delaware, Jeannie Feltzer, who's my friend. She wrote a great book. She's Caucasian American, but she spends a lot of time studying American history, especially Asian American history. You should bring her here to give you a lecture. It's a book called Driven Out. It's specifically about how the Chinese in this country have been driven out over the years and all the bloodshed. So the tactics for driving out the Chinese, because they were the largest Asian ethnicity in this country that posed a threat, was by a whole slew of tactics, basically, or strategies, one of which was taxes. Local governments would levy extra taxes on the laborers, and the laws, and also violence. Okay. And so that led to the decades of exclusion until 1943. And then in 1965, some of you may have heard of a new immigration law, which is the 1965 Immigration and the Naturalization Act. That's the one that is still standing, that basically guides how we admit people from other countries. And that basically eliminated a lot of the very stringent quotas from different parts of the world. So in the past, it was mostly the European immigrants that would have free pass coming to this country. And I'm not saying there was no discrimination against European immigrants. There were actually, there was rampant discrimination against the certain parts of European continents where people came from. I don't know if you remember the movie maybe from 20 years ago or so called The Far and Away. Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise played in that movie. Basically, that movie was about how Anglo-Saxon Americans discriminated against Irish Americans. In fact, it was kind of interesting. The former governor of Maryland, Martin O'Malley, who's of course Irish American. In his office, there was a plaque that says "No Irish need apply." He still used that to remind himself of the journey of people like him in this country. Now Irish Americans are quintessential Americans, right? You probably can't get any more American than Irish Americans, But back then, they were not considered real Americans. So every generation experienced discrimination or being perceived as outsiders. So the 1882 law was officially repealed after decades of being in place. World War II helped thaw the relationship between China and the United States significantly. That contributed to that. And the 1965 law essentially lifted the quotas. And then in 2012, there was an formal regret and apology issued by the United States Congress. And some of our local residents from Montgomery County actually pushed for that. So we should all feel very proud of that. But the impact of the Exclusion Act is actually long-lasting. Because of decades of exclusion, the Asian American population in this country is what it is, which is very small compared to many other communities. Can you imagine the difference it would have been made, right, if we have been allowed to migrate steadily over the years for another 60 or 70 years? And also, it has led to this otherness image about Asian Americans. To this day, people who were born and raised in this country were perceived outsiders simply because they have Asian names and look Asian. And people compliment them on their English because they don't expect them to speak English so well. That sense of otherness really impedes integration. It subconsciously tells you who you should play with and talk to. And those things are deeper into our national psyche because of that kind of Exclusion Act. And a lesson learned, I'll get back to, a lesson learned from that Exclusion Act is really, a historical lesson throughout the human history, which is when things get tough, we tend to find scapegoats, right? When the economy is good, we need more people. But when the economy gets bad, we want to hold on to what we have and then blame other people, whether it's what Nazis did to the Jews during World War II or what we did to the Chinese that led to 1882. It's the same pattern that gets repeated everywhere and over the years, over the generations. Yes.
So I actually just took a test on the Chinese Exclusion Act, and when they repealed it, the quota was that 100 people could come.
105.
105, but they had to be white.
Yeah.
They had to be white people from China coming to the U.S. So I think that's crazy. That was the official thing that they said about allowing Chinese back to the U.S.
To the United States. I wasn't aware of that detail. But yeah, I don't know how they came up even with 105. It's like what do you say to the person who's the 106th person, right? Waiting in the line, right? So there are other factors that contribute to this sense of otherness or what we call the perpetual foreigner image. There are books written about this perpetual foreigner image. Some of them are some of the labels and the stereotypes are so internalized. It becomes part of the Asian American psyche sometimes. So other factors include Americans' war on foreign soils. If you think about America's wars, most of them were fought in Asia, right? Other than the Independent War and Civil War, we did not have many wars in this country, short history of this country on our own soil in the United States. Most of the wars were fought on foreign soils, and they happen to be in Asian countries, whether it's the Korean War, Vietnam War, or the war or our fight against Japan, right? They were not on our soil, but they were against the people who looked like our enemies, who happened to be Asians. So there was anti-Asian sentiment over the past decades because people look certain ways, because they were mistaken identities. They got killed even though they were American-born citizens. They got incarcerated because they look certain ways or speak certain languages. Have you heard of the Japanese internment camp? That was a great example, right? American-born Japanese descent, American citizens in this case. Some of them enlisted in the US Army to fight for America, and their relatives would be incarcerated, interned in the internment camp, relocated from wherever their homes were. Remember, most Asian Americans live along coastal areas, cities. They would have to give up all their properties, everything, to be put in those internment camps in the middle of nowhere, Arizona, those desert areas. under Ronald Reagan, there was a redress, an official apology, so everybody got some compensation. But people lost many years of lives, and they lost touch with their relatives. It was a very tragic, another legal sanction, legal discrimination by the United States government against the Asians. And then there's one other incident in modern history, which happened 100 years after the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. It was a very tragic accident that became a pivotal moment that sparked the civil rights movement among the Asian Americans. It's called the Vincent Chen death. Okay, the death of Mr. Vincent Chen. He was a Detroit engineer working in the auto industry during the boom years of the auto industry in Detroit. But there was also a lot of competition from Japan. Because Japanese-made cars were cheaper, the oil efficient, and all that, they became very strong competitors with the United States. And that also did not sit well with a lot of the people who suffered economic woes, like got laid off because of the competition. So one night, it was a week before his bachelor's party, he was going to get married a week later. He got into altercation with people who called him names, who thought he was Japanese, picked on him. He knew a little bit about martial arts, so he fought back when they picked on him. And the father and son went back and got a baseball bat and beat him to death. And these two white auto workers who beat him to death essentially walked away free. Each was only fined for a few $1,000s and never jailed. Okay, that created outrage among the Chinese Americans and Asian Americans because it was a mistaken identity to begin with, right? So it could be anyone that looked like that, okay? And that really sparked the civil rights movement among the Asian Americans who said, in the past, our identity has been emperors, has been the feudalism or whatever, coolies. Now we are Americans. We need to tell people we are Americans. We need to be accepted as full Americans, And so there were a lot more civil rights organizations that were created because of that. And one of which was the Organization of Chinese Americans. I was the president of OCA, Organization of Chinese Americans, Greater DC chapter for a few years. It's still one of the largest civil rights organizations for Asian Americans in this country. So how do we go from the yellow peril to model minority, right? How do we go from being despised and feared to now, oh yeah, they are the most successful, they are the model minority, why can't you be as good as they are, basically, That essentially also creates a tension among Asians and the non-Asian minorities in many ways, okay? So part of that was because of the repeal of 1882 Act and 1965 immigration law, we have ushered in a lot of skilled immigrants to this country. And in fact, 72% of high-skilled workers on H-1B visa, you know that, right? Some of the American companies are so desperate in recruiting skilled laborers, they actually would appeal to Congress every year to expand the quotas for visa so that they can bring a lot of highly educated Indians and some other workers from different countries to this country. So not everyone who came to this country came here by themselves on their own. Some of them were sponsored by businesses because we just don't create enough laborers, high-skilled and affordable laborers in this country. And mostly from India and China, so there's a joke about how you go to any tech companies, half of them are Indians and half of them are Chinese, right? There's some truth to that because there are a lot of Indians and Chinese working in these tech companies. And most of the international student visas to this day go to Asian countries. In fact, in some small towns in America, their economy is sustained by international students attending their universities because they're not eligible for any scholarships. They pay for everything. Some of them come with a lot of money, a lot of cash, and they buy homes with cash, buy cars with cash. Some of our small town America economies are sustained by university-related economies, and a lot of that is international students spending and building families and careers in those small towns. How are we doing? Good? Any questions so far? I want to do a periodic check because I don't like monologues. When people look at me intensely, it could mean a number of things.
Just a question, as you just mentioned about the impact of visas and tech workers. I have a son who was out in Seattle and is in charge of a large department with Amazon. And one of their concerns are some of these attempts to limit, I don't know what the visas are called, that allow tech workers to come in.
Yeah, H-1B.
Right.
Yeah.
And one of the concerns he's seen with many of the employees is that they're afraid to leave to go back to visit because they're worried that they won't be able to come back because there'll be a change in between, and then people not willing to come because they're afraid of the same thing happening once they get here.
Sure.
I don't know if you.
Yeah, well, in this country, if you don't have green card, right, which is still called green cards, but it's permanent residency.
Well, some have
Right.
green cards and some are just here on the visa. But in either case,
Yeah.
there's concern about the lack of stability, I guess.
Sure,
would be the
sure.
word.
If you are just on visas could expire. And if you stay in this country with an expired visa, you are essentially an illegal alien.
Right, I'm
Yeah.
not talking about that. I'm
Right.
talking about people who are here legally, but because there's a lack of stability
Yeah.
in the way the government is interpreting or wanting to continue, they're afraid if they go home for a visit for 2
Right.
weeks, something will change.
That's
they
true.
will not be able to
That's
come
true.
back,
Yeah.
take the family home and come back.
Yeah.
It's not an issue of legality or not legality.
Right.
Because they're all
Yeah.
legal.
If you don't have a green card, that's always a concern. Things could always change on you. Even laws could change. So yeah, I agree. I can understand their concerns.
Well, but until recently, there wasn't an issue.
Well, it's because this
Right.
guy.
It's because of this. Yeah.
But
This administration,
current
right, that created the
administration.
uncertainty of, right, yeah, yeah.
And also, may I say
Sorry.
something?
Okay.
In the past, even if you're a legal resident American citizen, during the Great Depression and after World War II, the Mexican Americans, they were native, born here, they were deported. That's after the World War II and during the Great Depression. So even you are a U.S. citizen, you are not guaranteed to stay here.
And historically, I wasn't aware of that, but of course, these are people now in 2017. So they're not looking back, 80 years with knowledge of that. So it looks very unstable compared to what it has been for the last 30 or 40 years.
Yeah.
At least, but that's interesting, I didn't know that.
You have a question?
Just wondering whether interracial marriage is any different, the rates are any different among Asian Americans than other groups in the U.S., or is it, I don't even know the
Yeah.
rates, but I think it's quite
Yeah.
low, but I just wonder.
It's actually quite high.
It's quite high.
Depending also on ethnicities, I think. I don't have the number off top of my head, but I looked into that a few years back. I think in some areas where the Asian communities are more settled, multi-generations settlements, the ratio is quite high because by then they don't have language barriers. Everybody speaks English. I think it's almost like a 40% for some places or ethnicities. But in this region, because the Asians are relatively new, they speak different languages. Most of us tend to marry within our own ethnicities. So in other parts of the country, I've seen people who, like a Japanese marrying Chinese and Chinese marrying Koreans, and them marrying outside of their race, of marrying, Filipinos, marrying African Americans, and so there's, and marrying white Caucasian Americans, a lot of that. But in this area, it's limited because communities are still new. My husband is also Chinese immigrant, like me, from Shanghai. Yeah, I would assume it's fairly high. From my understanding, it's fairly high. Higher probably than the Latinos or the Black communities, I would say, yeah. Yes, I'm sorry.
You used a word a little while ago, looking for scapegoats.
Yeah.
And I think,
Yeah.
like you were saying, when we go through different economic waves, we have that coming out. I
Yeah.
think what we've been seeing in terms of our economy in the U.S. and probably Montgomery County to some degree has been insulated because of the federal government, has been other forces such as technology advances have made, and changes in the marketplace have made certain industries, coal or oil or other industries have had changes. And when we've had this economic disruption since 2004 in the U.S., all of a sudden people in some of those areas are looking for reasons why we don't have the jobs anymore, and they're not accepting the fact that either the market's changed or the technology has changed, but they're looking for scapegoats of, well, who can we say is responsible for this? And immigrants are in some way taking the brunt.
Well, this is partly the reason that we have Mr. Trump in the White House, right? President Trump in the White House, because he capitalized on people's fear and essentially encouraged the people blaming others for their own, for the market forces or for their own small town economic misfortunes. Part of it is really misunderstanding of how the global market works, because more than jobs being shifted abroad is the factor of technology taking away a lot of the jobs that used to be performed by humans. Because as consumers, we want automation. We want being able to go to ATM machine instead of talking to a teller, waiting in the line, and all that kind of thing. We want a lot of things that are convenient at fingertips. We want to shop on Amazon instead of having to go to Walmart or whatever. So market is changing, the world is changing, and many communities are not stepping up to pivot quickly enough. And Montgomery County is a very, fortunate community with a lot of assets, but I think we cannot be complacent because, yes, we have a strong economic foundation because of federal spending, but federal spending is not increasing. And if we don't diversify our industries and encourage entrepreneurship and make it easier to start business, we're going to be in trouble sooner or later. So that's part of my job, my day job, which is to push for the easier environment to create entrepreneurship and grow businesses and create jobs in the private sector, because you can't depend on one sector to have a sustained tax base to build good schools and life. Anyway, but that's, to your point, we're digressing a little bit, but it's a good point, everything is related, politics and economy and a community. So the model minority myth, which sounds so different from this perpetual foreigner image, right, is actually somewhat related because Asians, after the recent changes over the past few decades of changes immigration law, a lot more people with knowledge and education also came, and they changed the dynamic and people's perception of Asians. Many of them came as students, as scholars, as professors, and they became professionals and built a good life. And they are doing so well that they became branded as overachievers, as model minorities. And that's to the point I made earlier, which is in this country, we have certain connotations about what it means to be minority. A minority means you're less than, you're not as good as, right? So if you are so good, then you become a model minority. What does that mean? That means we have no expectations for minorities to be successful, right? Or you're not allowed to exceed the white community in terms of your achievement. Otherwise, we call you overachievers. So my question is, over what? Over whose expectations? What does overachieving means, right? Excellence is excellence. Achieving is achieving. Over what? We really need to ask ourselves when we label other people, And the students are called the whiz kids because they're doing so well. Time magazine called them whiz kids, and even President of the United States would lavish compliments on Asian community because they're doing so well. And they're overrepresented in higher education in the most prestigious institutions, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Stanford, because they have too many Asians, especially students from Montgomery County. They face this issue in terms of college admission. And local Asian American community, especially Chinese community and maybe some Indian communities, are frustrated because their kids have to have better test scores, more leadership experience, better everything in order to have a chance to get into the best of schools. And they believe it's not fair because the rules are not transparent to them. They don't know what else they need to do to prepare. They don't know what to tell their kids to motivate them. And they don't believe it's fair, you know. So it's no secret that you have to have a higher, that these institutions have higher bars for Asians. But another dynamic is the Asians are not just the Asian Americans applying to these institutions. Some of the competition comes from their home countries where their parents came from, right? So that is a very interesting global dynamic that nobody prepared for, okay? Because these institutions are global institutions.
Are there negative feelings between parts of the Asian community to each other? In other words, do the Vietnamese resent the Chinese capabilities, Chinese American capabilities,
You know,
or?
that's a good question, but I have not seen that locally. Partly because there's not much interaction. And they're also of very different backgrounds, and they're not very comparable. That's what I'm trying to say. The Vietnamese largely came here because they lost their country. That's how they call it. We lost our country. That was why we came here. They were fond of Nixon. They were fond of Republican Party for that reason, you know. And the Chinese are fond of Nixon too because he built a relationship with China, right? But very different reason why they came here. You know, they voluntarily came here to study. There's not much interaction and therefore animosity, not that I can see. In fact, interestingly, you would think the Taiwanese and Chinese might have some animosity, but there's none. They get along very beautifully. They sometimes have same celebrations and they, you know, attend the same events and all that, which is great. And also because STEM, you know, the science and technology fields in the United States has been limited to certain communities. When all of a sudden you have an army of people from Asian countries that are walking around with top scholarships and they look very smart and sound very smart, people are also, you know, pleasantly surprised, but they say, wow, those are, you know, really model minorities, they're overachievers, they do so well, they're smarter than me, they can crack all those maths that I have no idea about, you know, all that kind of thing. So all of these things seem to feed into people's perception about the Asians and the Asian stereotypes. You know, I'm sure if you were an Asian, you in this room, people will probably, you probably have had people who assume you're good at math or something like that, right? And the reason I said Asian Americans are an awkward minority is because of a point I tried to make earlier, which is how the rules are being applied. When the rules are fair and transparent, Asians tend to do well. So whenever there is lack of transparency, they get very disappointed and frustrated because the reason they came to this country was to escape that. The reason a lot of people chose to come to the United States was because back in their home countries, it was not the rule of law. Back in their home countries, you had to know someone. You have to have certain last names. They thought America is meritocracy. They thought finally there's a place where if you know the rule and work hard, you could get what you want. And whenever you change, you frustrate the heck out of them. But even if I don't always agree with the way they think, I can understand where they come from, okay? And that, what I'm trying to say next has everything to do with why they spoke out against the Trust Act, which is about sanctuary communities. So to say the Asians are against the illegal immigration is not quite fair. Even though I may not agree with what they say, I understand their mindset, which is if I have to wait in line, why should someone else cut in line, okay? It's not because they don't think people should come to this country and work hard and earn a living, because that was why they came here, okay? So it's because their fixation on fairness and transparency, because of why they left their countries, okay? And so I think understanding Asian Americans is taking a deep breath to understand why people left their countries and what matters to them and what matters to their success, okay? And in many ways, they think they are more American than Americans, right? They did everything that American seems to reward people for doing. And once they do so much of it, they get penalized. And so locally, what's being played out are some wedge issues that may not be good for the Asian American community's long-term integration and success or being or acceptance by the larger community. One of which was what I mentioned earlier, the sanctuary cities. What happened earlier this year was remarkable and startling. I don't know how many of you have any recollection around February earlier this year, this whole controversy about sanctuary cities, right? So what happened was there were laws by local lawmakers to try to make Montgomery County and Howard County, City of Rockville, and Howard County and the state of Maryland each introduced the legislation to try to make ourselves sanctuary communities so that people who are undocumented would not be reported to police. They would have protection by their local communities and law enforcement and all that. We would not have to comply with the federal mandate if they come going after certain people, okay? Because we want to be a welcoming and inclusive community to not break families apart. And I understand all of that. But when those bills were being debated and hearings took place, all of a sudden there were Asian community organizations spoke out strongly against sanctuary communities. That greatly surprised a lot of the leaders, legislators, who thought, wow, you are immigrants, right? How could you speak out against any other immigrant groups? You know, where's your heart? How could you be so cruel? You're racists. You're right-wing radicals. Immediately, they were labeled all kinds of things, which then shocked them. They said, well, don't you encourage democracy? Don't you encourage people speaking out, right? How could you call us names when this is what you told us to do? Participate in the democratic process. So that created a lot of tension and misunderstanding, okay? And another wedge issue is MCPS policies related to access to special programs like gifted and talented programs, right? MCPS has historically been taking great pride in its efforts to lower achievement gaps, to narrow achievement gaps, because it is my belief, as well as many people's beliefs, that one of the best things about America is its public education. And if done right, the purpose of public education is to mitigate the predictors of race and income as much as possible, right? So when you go through the 13 years, K to 12, all of these predictors become less predictors so that all of us have basic skills to be productive citizens of this country. Unfortunately, many of these predictors are still stubborn predictors, okay? In our effort to narrow achievement gaps, how can we make sure we still stay competitive is an issue. And some of the local Asian parents feel that the MCPS is going too far in one direction, and they are saying, you know, when I moved here, we had three high schools that were ranked by U.S. News and World Report as, you know, best among the top 100 high schools in the country, and now there's only one. So I already bought properties. I already invested in this community. I built a business and all that kind of thing, right? Why should people still come here if your brand is no longer the brand, you know? And so all of these things become issues that we had never really anticipated. And, you know, because their kids had a harder time getting to best schools, some of them also spoke out against affirmative action. And I'm saying all these things not to say all Asians agree on these issues, okay? Or that all of them care about these issues. That would be gross exaggeration. But I'm just presenting some phenomena that are bubbling up that we never had anticipated. And they need to be paid attention to because there is momentum and there is movement. They will be reflected in their political leanings. And we are getting more purple as a community anyway, you know. Because some of them voted for Trump. I know that. They were very vocal about that. So what holds Asian American community together? It's not the culture and religion and all that. It is the Americanness, which is American ingenuity. It is our values, beliefs, and attitudes. It's our spirit, right? That's what it means to be an American anyway, you know. You don't have to look certain ways. You don't have to speak certain languages. And then locally, what glues the communities together are the faith communities, the language schools, and the hometown associations, the professional organizations. I often say, you know, the Korean church is like the Chinese school. That's where you find everybody. That's where you solve all your problems. You know, that's where you sell houses and everything to each other and all that. Over time, as our children's generation grow up, I believe some of the wedge issues, some of the divisions will also disappear. As they share the same language and same experience, they will also find it much easier to speak to each other. And I'm already seeing that. And this region is actually also seeing that already. You know, I have seen more Asian Americans participating in political process. They speak out more. They have their own PACs now. They are donating to political campaigns. They are also encouraging others to speak out. But one of the things we have to pay attention to is large number of Asian Americans, even if they register to vote, they tend to be independents. They don't vote in the primary, which means they get greatly disadvantaged in voicing their voices in our democratic process, because Maryland has closed the primary, right? We don't allow people who are not affiliated with the parties to vote in the primary for important political offices. And what that means is a lot of people who don't know how the political system is played get left out until the general election, which is in many ways less significant even than the primary election. But who's telling them that? Who's translating that into actions and encourage people to participate, you know? So over the years, I've been doing a lot of that by writing and educating and speaking out and holding their hands and making sure that they participate. So a lot of times we have misperceptions about different communities because we think we know them or we have talked to a few of them. But at the end of the day, I think all communities care about the same things: education, economy, you know, good jobs, transportation, and a strong sense of upward mobility. We just need to have the kind of humility to listen and to engage, and not come to them when we need their votes and money, but come to them when we actually want to help them and solve their problems. That's part of the Asian American community too, sentiment too. They are very grateful for the opportunities this country has afforded. Many of them are starting to pay more attention to local affairs and contribute money and talent and time, but they also want to be better understood and listened to, just like all people. And so finally, I just want to say, all of you together make who we are as a community. We should not just say diversity is a beautiful thing and leave it at that. It's hard work. It's very hard work. If you can serve on different kind of communities boards, if you can facilitate a seminar, if you can read articles, circulate around, and just go to different things to push yourself out of your cultural comfort zone, it's a good thing. That's how you build communities, starting with the dialogues. And it's hard. It is hard. And all of us are all too busy. But starting from local level is really the best way to make a difference. This is what we have more control over. This is our community, and it will take every part of the community to build a better future together. So I hope you have found this to be thought-provoking, to be informative. I don't mean to just talk about it from statistical perspective. I want to weave into personal experiences and push out some difficult subjects for you smart, caring people to think about, because this is a wonderful educational opportunity for all of us. It is history in the making, right? So thank you. Thank you.